Okay, so my presentation is summarized in this slide here. Basically, I'm going to start out talking a little bit about where I'm coming from, what's the OECD, and what is the Development Assistance Committee. I'm going to be talking a lot about what is this measurement framework, TOSSD, and explaining the basics of that measurement framework. And I'm going to be, in that regard, sort of describing what's been happening in the international financial system over the past 20 years that's radically changed sort of what we're looking at in terms of the access that developing countries have to different kinds of finance and the importance of them to be able to mobilize those resources in order to make the investments that they need to do in order to achieve the sustainable development goals in their nations. Because the SDG agenda, which I'm not sure everybody is familiar with, but it's a very ambitious, transformative vision that the international community agreed upon in 2015. It maps out where we're headed, what we want to accomplish in terms of improving the lives and the welfare of everybody in the world over the next 15 years. And this measurement framework is going to help the international community monitor the financial resources that are becoming available and that are being deployed in developing countries to achieve the SDGs. And it's really important for us to have a handle on what's happening with that money, because developing countries need to understand how to manage that money. So first off, what's the OECD? Well, I think probably that second bullet there is the best description. It is a think tank cum international conference center. There are 34 countries that belong to the OECD. You may have heard it referred to as the rich man's club. But with globalization and with tremendous changes that have happened in the economic international environment over the past 30 years, we now have many, many countries who are very actively engaged in our work. I think there's like about 100 developing countries who are participating in meetings that are taking place in Paris, where the OECD is based. We have 250 committees that meet at the OECD. Many of those committees meet more than once a year. Every year, there's 40,000 people who are coming from member countries and from developing countries to participate in the meetings of these committees. And the most important asset that the OECD has is that 40,000 member state participants who come to our meetings, because they provide us with the insights, with the information, with the statistics about what they're doing in their countries that works and that is most effective. And it has a lot of implications for public policy writ large, because in the OECD, these 250 committees, they deal with just about every aspect of public policy that you can think of. The only things that we don't really deal with are defense and space. But even with space, we've had some work that we've done over the past few years. So it's an immense agenda that the OECD is working on in concert with representatives from the member countries. And one of the most important things that the OECD does is establish information, collect good data, good comparable data, which enables them to analyze what's happening in member countries. And then on the basis of discussions that take place in those committees, we learn about what is the best way to do things. And sometimes we're able to get agreement across all the members for everybody to do things in certain policy areas in the same way. And that is cooperation, that's multilateral, and that's the OECD. Now, one of those 250 committees is the Development Assistance Committee. It's one of the most important committees at the OECD. It meets 35 times a year. We have representatives who are based in Paris. That's very unique because our committee meets that frequently. And the work of the OECD Development Assistance Committee is to try and increase the amount of resources that are being provided to developing countries, improve the impact of the use of those resources, and there's a huge kind of disciplinary function to the Secretariat of the OECD, because we monitor our members. So we're making sure that they deliver on what they promise that they're going to do. So if there's an agreement among the DAC members to reduce poverty in a certain way or to deal with governance in another way, and if we're able to get everybody around the table to agree to do things in a certain way, we will come back afterwards and monitor what everyone is doing to make sure that they're holding up their side of the bargain. And a very important part of the work that the DAC does is collecting statistics in order to measure what resources are being provided to poorer countries. And we do that in an effort to ensure that we can provide that data to different audiences, civil society in our member countries, or the governments themselves, for accountability purposes. And this is part of sort of the disciplinary function of the Secretariat, because in the aid scheme, countries have made commitments about the amount of resources that they're going to provide to developing countries. And we're there to make sure that they deliver on those commitments. So I'm going to be talking to you today about a new metric for measuring international finance to achieve the SDGs, total official support for sustainable development. Trevor Manuel, who was a very famous finance minister from South Africa right after the liberation of South Africa, he said it all. He said, if you can't measure it, you can't monitor it. We need to get a good handle on how money is coming together and where, how, and what for it is being deployed. The Millennium Development Goals were the world's first attempt to develop a global agenda for achieving the reduction of poverty and the improvement of welfare of countries and peoples all over the world. But they didn't really think, when they devised the SDGs, about the money. The only thing that they thought about in terms of the resources that agenda was going to call for was to think about aid, official development assistance. That's the money that Ms. Quevedo referred to in her introduction, where she told you that of the members of the DAC, they provide $145 billion every year. And 70% of that $145 billion is given in the form of grants. So it's gifts to developing countries. And in the MDG era, they only thought about that money. But in fact, since the MDGs were devised in 2000, there's been momentous change in the world, in financial markets, in investors, and in the growth of developing countries who have themselves become active actors in terms of investing. So we need now a new measure for monitoring and measuring the resources going to develop the SDGs, because the world has changed so much. In the next few slides, I'm going to describe to you exactly how that landscape for finance has changed. But the real impetus for coming up with this measurement framework are these leading questions that I have on this screen right here. And I'm going to read them through because they're really important for you to understand. How is SDG financing coming together at the country level? What are the sectors? What kinds of activities? And who is involved? Are there orphan countries? Are there gaps and declining trends that could jeopardize progress? Well, in monitoring ODA over the past 50 years, we've been looking on this kind of thing with official development assistance, this concessional resources. But now in the SDG era, we have lots of more actors. We have lots of different kinds of financial instruments. We have lots of different sources of finance that are coming into play. So we need something to be able to capture it. We also need to understand how developing countries themselves can get a handle on the potential that exists for them to access resources. So developing countries, there's a huge agenda here for them to learn from one another about how they can tap international capital markets, about how they can inveigle foreign direct investment, good, sustainable foreign direct investments within their territories, and how they can combine those resources and best invest it to achieve the SDGs. How and from where is development finance mobilized, and how can it be delivered most effectively? Again, this is something that the statistics will reveal. And finally, how can the international community work together to provide statistical data on SDG resources that is comprehensive, comparable, and consolidated? And this is a very important aspect of this agenda, and I have a slide that's coming up fairly soon that will describe to you a little bit more in detail how the complexity of international finance is now taking place. This slide provides some information on the trends over the past 15 years with international finance for developing countries. And you'll see here that the top light blue shows personal remittances has become a very important and a growing source of finance in developing countries. We see that non-ODA, that's the next and the largest area in that graph, is really growing quite strongly. It's now accounting for most of the resources. And that non-concessional resource, that's bank loans, that's foreign direct investments, that's venture capital, that's all different kinds of resources that are being provided principally from the private sector. So the private sector is really an actor now in financing development. And you see ODA at the very bottom, that's only from the OECD DAC members, that's only 30 countries. So it's not the world, there are plenty of emerging donors who are providing resources. But ODA it's flat, and it's a declining share in a relative sense to all the other sources of finance now. So that's why we need a measure that can capture all of these resources. And this bottom part of the graph shows a little bit for the year 2013, the relative share of these different subcomponents of finance. So personal remittances is 34, up a little bit more than a third of the total resources that we used to finance development. Foreign direct investment is 21%. ODA was 10%. And these new financial instruments that have become a real factor now in international development finance, they account for 15% of resources now. 10 years ago, they weren't even on the screen. We also have, in the SDG era, we have lots of new actors that are on the screen. This diagram here shows different sort of communities, private sector, multilaterals, bilaterals, development finance institutions, export credit institutions. The circle in the middle, the blue, that shows sort of the official component of what these actors are providing. But there are additional resources that they're providing. They're not concessional, they're not cheap. And they now are deploying everything in development. So we need to be able to get a handle on what's happening outside of the circle. This slide shows you a little bit about what's happening in terms of what I referred to previously, these emerging donors. On the right-hand side, you see sort of what's been happening with the Development Assistance Committee community. So they've been providing between 135, 145 billion per year, more or less on that average over the past 8 years. But look what's been happening with these developing country donors. China, Turkey, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Malaysia. There's a lot of countries that are now providing resources. UAE and the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, huge. So this graph on the left-hand side shows how the resources from those countries have risen very dramatically over the past 8 years. This slide shows what's happening in terms of the pattern of finance that's being received by different kinds of countries. On the left-hand side, you see least developed countries, these are the poorest countries. And for those countries, ODA, or official development assistance, is still the predominant source of resources. So here we have it at 72%. But if you look on the right-hand side, these are other countries. And in those contexts, official development assistance only accounts for about 11% of their total financing mix. So they are more and more relying on other sources of finance, and importantly, private sector finance. And this is particularly important for the middle-income countries that are facing very specific challenges in terms of their development paths and also their access to resources. This final slide in this area where I'm trying to describe to you how the international financial landscape has dramatically changed over the past 15 years. It shows a typical complex financing operation. It involves concessional loan from the World Bank, and it involves also a guarantee from a regional development bank and finance that was provided by a private bank. So in this scenario here, if you look at the turquoise square, that's information that we have data for right now. We know that World Bank loan is going to be reported to us. But we have no idea about what's happening with the other two sources of resources that are financing that solar panel project. The Regional Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the money that they're providing, and also the private investor. We have no idea. And we need to find out what's happening, where that money is coming from. We, in the sense of donor countries, but also very importantly, developing countries themselves. And this final slide in this section, this is describing to you sort of what it is that we are dealing with today. So we did a big data search to try and identify different databases in the international sphere where you could get some information, some data about resource flows. And these 5 sort of clusters or fireworks or pinwheels are tabulating what we found for 5 different kinds of sources of data. One, we have private sector, so that's like consulting companies, it's banks, it's interest groups from the banking sector, it's investment banks, etc. We have the bilateral community, we have the multilateral, and we have capital markets. Now, all this information, we identified 250 sources. They are completely chaotic. You can have absolutely no idea about what's happening in totality or in a consolidated sense across all of this data, because everybody's using different definitions. They're using different eligibility criteria. They're using different ways of measuring those resources. And therefore, it's just impossible for you to understand, sort of by looking at these 250 different databases, what it is that we're dealing with. So that's where we're hoping that TOSSD is going to be able to help us come up with something that is consolidated, that's comparable, and that's very important, and that's also coherent in terms of giving a big picture about what's happening with financing for development. So this slide very simply lays out what is the basic definition of TOSSD. Very important, it's only measuring external resources coming into developing countries, and it's only measuring officially supported resources. So it's not measuring private sector finance. And it is looking at both what multilateral institutions, what bilateral institutions, and what civil society institutions are providing. It's a 2-pillar framework. So we have on the one hand a data set that is capturing resources that are crossing the border into developing countries. And on the other hand, we have a data set that is capturing what's happening in terms of how the international community, how official agencies, bilateral, multilateral, civil society, how they are helping us achieve the SDGs in some very important areas that are known as global public goods. And this slide right here is laying out for you a little bit about what are these global public goods that we're hoping that this pillar is going to be capturing. In a sense, the SDGs contain a lot of really ambitious aspirations about trying to improve inequality, transforming lives, governance, et cetera, et cetera. These things are efforts that are broad. They don't come reduced to a resource flow that's going into a developing country. Many of these kinds of resources are deployed for global programs or for regional programs, because essentially global public goods are things that help or that hinder development and that that go beyond borders. So these are things that are essential for development, but they are not financed by the people who use them or who are able to profit from them. So there's nobody there who's taking responsibility for providing those global public goods. You're a free rider if you are able to rely on having stable international financial markets, or a fair and transparent international trade regime, or being able to address climate change, having environmental sustainability, peace and security, human rights. All of these things are global public goods. And this is where TOSSD is very innovative or unprecedented. And it's because these essential aspects of development, we have never been able to get a handle on how the international community is financing the access to those global public goods. So we're hopeful that TOSSD will help us get a handle on that. This slide gives you a little bit of a picture of sort of the mechanics of collecting this data. So what we're thinking will happen is that there'll be different groups of providers that will, among themselves, and in line with the instructions that we are now developing with the UN, those provider groups will collect among each other the data for TOSSD, for those two pillars. So, of course, the OECD DAC will be collecting data, but we'll also have the Arab donors that will be able to, among their members, identify, measure, and tabulate those resources. The same thing for the emerging donors, for China, Brazil, India, the BRICS. They all have their emerging institutional frameworks for working together, and they will ostensibly ultimately be able to report and to provide data to a central international collection agency, which we have yet to devise. But the idea here is that the collection of the data is not going to be an additional burden for developing countries. So it's a resource, an information resource for developing countries to help them plan their development strategies and understand best how they can finance those strategies. But they will not be burdened by having to do the dirty work to collect the data. This slide basically recapitulates the key aspects of TOSSD. It's external finance, it's official. Very important, TOSSD is going to make it possible for us for the international community, for the UN system, to get a handle on what all official agencies and actors are doing. And as it stands right now, while we really don't know what's happening with a lot of the emerging providers, we don't know, we have good estimates that we derive based on government information that they publish when they publish it, but we don't really have a very good handle on it, and therefore the world doesn't understand what those countries are providing, and most importantly, developing countries don't have clarity on sort of what is China doing in their borders, really, between the finance ministry and the health ministry and other parts of government. Sometimes there's Chinese walls. They don't know sort of what's going on, even the central bank. So it's important we're hopeful that TOSSD will somehow improve this kind of situation in that these emerging providers would also be reporting against the standard. This slide gives you a little bit of insight in the magnitude of the kind of resources that we're talking about here. So we did a pilot study in Denmark, and we had already the data for ODA provided by Denmark, and we found that when we talked with the people of the Danish government, that they were providing more resources in the TOSSD measurement framework. And this little rectangle out to the side, it says private sector resources mobilized. That is additional resources that the Danish government has mobilized by using leveraged finance mechanisms. So it's with guarantees and with collective investment securities and different kinds of of collective sort of bank finance arrangements that are taking place. These are resources, additional resources that have been mobilized by Denmark for helping developing countries finance their SDGs. So this is where you can get some kind of an understanding of, well, there's a lot of resources here that are passing us by. We don't know what's happening, and developing countries don't know either. And the international community doesn't know. And that's really important because in the UN context, they're going to be monitoring the SDGs. So there are meetings that are going to be taking place every 5 years by the high-level political forum. And they're going to go and look what's happening on the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is the financing agenda for the SDGs. And they're going to wonder sort of how is the finance coming together? And we are hopeful that TOSSD is going to be able to come at providing some kind of hard empirical data that's comparable, that's comprehensive, and that's timely, that the UN system will be able to take note of in order to understand sort of how the SDGs are being financed. What are the challenges? The challenges that we have are we need to make sure that TOSSD operations are not creating any kind of disruptive problems. So sometimes when you get a guarantee from a government that's going to a private company, that can be creating some economic distortions. So we want to make sure that that kind of thing is not happening. We also want to make sure that the TOSSD resources are aligned with international standards for environment and social concerns and whatnot. We also want to try and convince all of the actors in development finance that reporting to TOSSD is in their interests and in the interests of developing countries, and that's a real challenge for us. And also ensuring that the governance and oversight of TOSSD will be in the UN system. That's another hurdle that we need to square. With that, I come to the end of my presentation. So if there are any quick questions, I don't know if I've gone over my time. I've gone over my time. Sorry, but I hope you found it interesting. I hope you understand a little bit about what TOSSD is. And if you have any questions in the remainder of the day, please feel free to come up and ask me. Thank you.